Hey, open screeners, Bill Campbell here with a little filmmaking experiment. Now this experiment that I'm going to be showing you actually was inspired by the work of one of our members, Ted Ryan, who you may remember a few months ago showed us a little thing that he'd thrown together called Traveler. Now I'm going to show you just a short excerpt from that to remind you what that was like. So what's interesting about this film is that Ted shot it with a cell phone of himself in his own office space. It was the ultimate in guerrilla filmmaking. But I think Ted is really good at visual storytelling. This film has no dialogue at all, but by using interesting camera angles, jacking with the color a little bit, and bringing in some sound effects to sell the sci-fi vibe, it turns out surprisingly well. Okay, so that is Ted's film. I just showed you about 30 seconds of it. You can see more of it on his site, I think. Anyway, I really like Ted's film. Obviously, he was working under severe constraints, zero budget, guerrilla, catch as catch can, just using his own self as the actor. But it got me to thinking, it sort of inspired me to think about, are there some ways that with a relatively low budget, can we sell the whole outer space adventure a little bit better than just a little bit of sound effects and some colorization? And I came up with a few ideas on how I might be able to do that, and that's what I've been playing around with. Here are the ideas that I came up with. Improving the camera, the lighting, the colorization, improving the costume and the props, improving the titles, and finally simulating a zero-G environment if we can do that credibly. So now what I'd like to show you is the end result of my experimenting that's taken place over the last more time than I really want to admit. Probably total cost that I invested in various things and trial and error, not all of which actually made it into the final cut. I might have spent a couple of $100s on various items, but I'm going to show you the end result first, and then I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about how I did it. All right, so let's go back and review the goals that I had for improvement on this particular little scene. The first was camera, lighting, and colorization. I think on the camera work, I probably didn't significantly improve on the work that Ted had done with his little cell phone. I think with the lighting and colorization, the color correction, I think we did improve that enough that I'm going to call that criteria successful and check it off. I'm going to declare it a success. The costume and props, I think that most people would agree that it's a definite improvement, and I personally, I feel like I got out of it what I wanted in terms of the credibility of the costume and the props. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I made the costume in just a moment, but for now I'm going to declare that one to be a success as well. The titles, all I really did was I swapped out the sort of bland, generic titles with something a little bit more of a high-tech typeface and some animation. I'm going to say that that one was good as well. And in addition to the titles, one thing that I didn't mention earlier was something that my editor, Roberto Guimaraes, brought in, the electrical shocks, the sparking, which I think did definitely help to sell the concept as well. Finally, we have the simulation of the zero-G environment, and I think that worked out fairly well too with slow-mo, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about exactly how I did the simulation of both the astronaut and the tool. So I'm going to call that one successful as well. I'm going to just say I'm satisfied with what I was trying to accomplish with this, and I think that it worked out well. So let's talk about exactly how I did it. So in order to fake the zero-G weightlessness thing, what I did was I rigged up a kind of a makeshift swing that I hung from the rafters in my basement. We had to have the tool sort of fly off to the side, so I suspended that from the ceiling as well. First I tried using a fishing line filament, but then on the recommendation of Roberto Guimaraes, my assistant, I switched over to black thread, which we think worked a little bit better in terms of just being less reflective for the camera. So I ended up going to the party store and picking up a revolving light and a strobe light. The strobe light, in retrospect, I'm not sure what I was thinking. There's no guarantee that this strobe light is going to synchronize with your frames per second. That was really a very bad idea, and I solved the problem a different way in post-production later. Okay, this is a 14-inch diameter clear acrylic globe lighting fixture, which I obtained from superiorlighting.com for about $40. You'll see that the opening though is only 5 inches in diameter, and so I've got to open that up larger in order to fit a head through it. This is an embroidery ring, which I picked up at Michael's for maybe $4 or $5, something like that. As you can see, you can take it apart, and it's designed to sort of hold fabric in place. But this seems to work as the junction between the bubble of the helmet and the uniform. What I'm doing here is I'm just taking that ring that I showed you, I'm placing it on the plastic globe around the existing hole so that I can mark a hole that's the correct size for being able to fit my head through it. And here obviously what I'm doing is I'm taking a jigsaw and I am just cutting along the mark that I made with a Sharpie on the plastic helmet. And it takes a few minutes to do that, and unfortunately the friction of the saw does tend to melt the acrylic a little bit and cause it to refuse, and that's why I have to bang piece. It doesn't just fall out. The heat of the friction of the saw tended to refuse the plastic afterwards. Okay, I don't really remember exactly how much I paid for this over at Ocean State Job Lots. It looks a little bit like a uniform. It's got the epaulets on the shoulders, and at least in the lighting that I intended to use, I thought it might work as a spacesuit. Finally, what I did was I attached that ring that I showed you earlier to the uniform, put a bead of glue around that plastic ring, and then I affixed the bubble to that, and I'm all set. Well, that's what I got for you today. I hope you found it interesting, maybe even useful, applicable to some future sci-fi project that you might be working on. For my part, I think that I accomplished what I intended with this little experiment, to show that on a relatively short budget, I could make something that was believable to an audience of an outer space, sci-fi adventure. So if you have any questions about it, of course, you can approach me afterwards. But otherwise, until next time, remember what Ryan Connolly over at Film Riot always says.
Until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.